Hello everybody, welcome to this promotional video in which I will be introducing the importance of the next project that I will be undertaking, which is the so-called problem of house division based on a tape series that Schmidt published in, I believe, 2016, yes, as you can see here in the copyright, which was accompanied by this paper, the so-called problem of house divisions, in which he defined all sorts of new Greek terms that he had used and learned in the previous long period of associating himself with Greek astronomical and astrological texts, which are not written as essays but are written as learning tools, sort of. So these astrological texts contain many, you could say, secrets of sorts, having to do with all sorts of deep lying conceptualizations and methods and ideas about how you needed to delineate a chart. And one of the more important ones is, of course, the things having to do with the places, what we now call houses, but that's also one of the problems because the domiciles of the planets are their houses, but the domicile refers explicitly to the image belonging to certain planets, or where certain planets have all sorts of responsibilities for, which we can see in the table of essential dignities. So this will be coming soon, and I will give a short introduction now in the manner of a 10 slides which will introduce the issues and the problems having to do with the modern conceptions, even modern traditional conceptions of how to use the houses. So let's have a look. Now I will be specifically addressing whole sign houses and the equal places, because in the video series of me on eminence factors, I have talked about the issue of the quadrant house division, which is now called the porphyry house system, but that was, as I argumented there, which was strongly based on what Robert Schmidt found and produced and suggested, was that this was especially used for getting to grips with the idea of predomination, which planet or what light in the chart is really suited to be indicative of ruling, perhaps, and even indicating eminence in somebody's life. But the big issue is that these quadrant places, this porphyry house system, was never used to replace the significations of the images. The attributes ascribed to them were not meant to be transferred to this quadrant house system. So that's a very important conclusion, because that actually suggests that these were specifically used for something else and not specifically used for trying to investigate topics. So that's a very important conclusion on that. So this video that I'm now introducing to you will be coming soon in large detail, because it's a very important topic for chart delineation. But let me talk about the problems of this issue having to do with topics and places. So, well, the first thing that happened to me was that reading this paper of Schmidt on this topic, the house conversations that he had with two of his interlocutors, was that actually it was a sort of a wake-up call, in the sense that I believe it was since I got acquainted with whole sign places, especially by studying zodiacal releasing, because that is a method that is explicitly using whole sign places. So I'm not quite sure when I started using them solely and without any reference to any cusp system. I believe that was a few years later, I'm not quite sure, but I even started doing it for horary charts, and I was quite happy with it. But the wake-up call is this, that even Valens in the 2nd century AD actually said that this was not the right thing to do. in this citation, this quotation, and the new translation that Schmidt did on Valens Book 9, Chapter 3, is that if someone should reckon generally, which is the word platikos, a single place for each sign, which is a rare occurrence, they are engaged in acts of constraint and violence or in entangling matters. So I'm being accused of having hubris in using only the whole sign places for the topics that I did. So, as Schmidt said, following this translation, it is any person advocating the sole use of whole house sign places who is guilty of the acts mentioned. So that was an act of hubris on my part. And he further on commented in another slide. So again, here is what Schmidt said about this, and I'm just reading the last part of this quotation, is that he said, what I am certain about is that this is a terribly strong admonition to not just use one system rather than the other, but when the whole sign places are being discussed, always pay attention to the equal places. So yeah, this is the admonition that I should quit using whole sign places solely and need to use them together with the equal places. So that's interesting, and so I'm going to abandon using whole sign places, but that raises a lot of hairy questions and a lot of hairy issues in how to use these places. So that's something that needs to be investigated, and that's actually the reason why I wanted to start this project about getting to know these principles and trying to get to sort them out and try to use them in our delineation. So, but before I can do that, I need to really explicate all the things going on when you start using these things together. So let's have a look. So the first thing that I mentioned was stop using whole sign places on their own as representing the topics. And the second problem is that the idea of the transfer of topics to the other new house systems that are going on everywhere in the astrological community. So this is a very strong statement. Never was there an original intent to transfer topics to quadrant divisions, and that's an interesting one. And that also means that there was an original conception of the idea of topos, meaning place, but also topic. And the second problem is, or perhaps the third problem, is that modern astrologers call these things a house. And as I said before, that also interferes with the term domicile of the planet, which is their house where they are at home, so to speak. So the confusing terminology is also rampant, and this perhaps even the third sort of problem with these matters, having to do with the translation of ancient Greek texts. Okay, be that as it may, let's look at the modern ideas, and here you see all the house systems offered by most astrological software. And the thing is that they are all used to define house cusps, and which is a big and the corresponding houses, and attributing the topics that we normally would use for the whole sign places are now transferred to these places, and they can be really quite different from the whole sign places and the things that the whole sign places indicate as to topics. So that's one of the problems going on with these, and there's a lot to say about this, but one thing that's very important, because that is often levied as an argument against using whole sign places at all, and in favor of cusp systems, which the choice of which is quite personal often. In my case, when I studied astrology, I learned it with the method of Placidus, but that's just as all the other ones, that's quite a random choice, and the only reason I started doing that was because my teacher used them and he taught me astrology, so I started using Placidus house system. So and that is, I think, the case for most modern astrologers. You just start using the place that your teacher taught you, and without any discussion about the how and why of these systems. But problem with that is that all these systems are all sort of approached from the idea of mapping. And Schmidt said when house division is approached as a mapping problem, that then it becomes a problem, because when house division is approached from this perspective, any mapping is intrinsically imperfect. And modern astrologers recognize this. And as he said, I maintain that the Greek astrologers were not approaching the division of places as a problem of mapping three-dimensional space into the ecliptic. Instead, they were referring divisions proper to the ecliptic to a reference frame. Now, what we often see is that all these different systems of calculating cusp places, cusp houses, there's a lot of confusion about the arguments for why these cusp calculations should be used, and they are, as Schmidt said, often addressed as the imperfection of any house system. But when that is approached as the inherent problem of house divisions, then it's often argued and argumented with the argument that each system can be used for a specific topic or a specific investigation of the chart, so that each of them is deemed qualified for a specific investigation, and very often this is to the astrologer's preference. I use Koch for this reason, I use Marinus for that reason, and I use Campana's cusps for that topical inquiry of the chart. So, and these rather random motivations are often motivated with the argument, it works for me, which is a really silly argument when you are approaching astrology as a system like Robert Schmidt did. So this is what you can encounter when you start using whole sign houses and debating about the use of cusp systems. So Vetches Valens introduced the idea of equal places in Book 4, Chapter 12, and there's a whole argument in Schmidt's handout about the use of the word dodecatropos, and when I quote the last sentence, we might translate "Hey dodecatropos" as the 12-fold way of being turned, and that is something about the equal places and this idea of being turned. Schmidt said that in Book 9, Chapter 3, it clearly refers to a system of 12 equal places reckoned from the ascending degree. And you can see in this chart that the ascending degree is placed in each of the images at the same portion of as the one of the ascending degree. So that is quite an easy way of reckoning equal places. And then Schmidt goes on to say that for the moment it is only important to note that this word, dodecatropos, is never used in presentations of the places in terms of whole signs, the whole sign places. So that's an important one to differentiate between what is meant with the whole sign places and what is meant with these equal places. So Schmidt motivated the reason for presenting the material that he retranslated in this handout for the so-called problem of house division by dividing it into two parts. In the first part, there are two main parts to the recorded conversation, and the first is a textual analysis of several different sources found as Valens, Firmicus Maternus, and Paul of Alexandria, leading to the conclusion that the system of whole sign places and that of equal places reckoned from the ascending degree were conceived of together and intended to be used together for topical inquiries. So that is the most important thing to state for the moment. They were used together, and you cannot say that the angular equal places were used for strength considerations, which is something that had to do with the quadrant division, which is something else. So that's an important one to take into account, and also not to simply convert the topics belonging to a whole sign image to the equal place equally. So there is something going on there, and that's interesting. Just to note, the second part of the conversation contains a more extensive exploration of the meanings of several Greek astrological terms, and that's of course the forte of Mr. Schmidt, being able to go deep into the etymology of certain Greek terminology, astrological terminology. So when this is the case, then we have a lot of questions to answer, because how is this then to be understood and used? So what is the relation of the whole sign places and the equal places? What interaction is going on, and what is exactly shown by having a cusp of an equal place in a certain image? What's going on there? I will show you in another slide. And the question then, of course, is what is a cusp actually? What is it doing? What can we say about the equal places because of the fact that there is a cusp in a certain whole sign image? And the other very important question, of course, is what are planets doing when they are in certain portions, certain parts of a whole sign image, which is perhaps the same equal place or perhaps the other one. So that's all quite important to get a grip on and get an idea of. So that's important to take into account. So it's not about transferring the topics from the whole sign place to the equal places, but there's something else going on. So let me have a look at what all the problems can be when you are confronted with this material for the first time. So the question is, as I said, what is the relation of all these two different systems? What is a cusp actually, and what do planets do in these places or with them? And here I've shown a chart with the equal places, and this is my new chart form. I have made a yellow marking for the pivotal places in whole sign places, and I have introduced the portions of the ascendant degree in all the other images, and here you see a rather extreme version of what can happen. As you can see that the rising portion of this chart is relatively late in an image, and that happens then in all the other images. So that's an interesting thing. So let's have a look at what this might suggest as a possible problem. So I've also numbered the whole sign places, as you can see here. And let's have a look at this little piece of this chart. So what we have here is that this, what I marked out here now, that is the equal ninth place, because it's 30 portions in width. So it starts with the portion of the rising degree of the horoscopus, which is the 27th degree of each image, and in the 27th degree of the fishes, there begins the ninth place, as you can see in the numbering at the bottom in the middle circle of this bigger picture. And you can also see that a rather large portion of the 10th image is encapsulated by this equal place. So that's interesting. So we have several questions to address in this. So what does this mean for these portions? The last portions of the Pisces belonging to the ninth place proper, but the rest of the portions divided by all these cusps, the equal cusps, it is up to us to try to understand what is happening there. What is going on with these portions? What is going on with the portions being in the ninth place, equal place, but also referring to the 10th whole sign image? What's going on there? And what's going on with the last portion of the 10th image, which is actually suggesting that the 10th place, the 10th equal place, begins at the very last portions of the 10th whole sign place. So that's interesting, and of course we also have to try to get to grips with what does that mean specifically for the moon being in the portions belonging to the 10th place, but actually being in the 9th equal place. That's a lot of questions to answer and get to grips with what this all might signify. So that's an important reason why I am starting this project on the whole sign places and the equal places. So let me sort of recapitulate. Again, it is not about transferring the topics from the whole sign places to the equal places, because there's a difference between them, and it's of course high time that these matters were addressed. And of course the objection might be, well, other translators address these issues as well, and this is what Schmidt had to say about them. You cannot always trust these translations, because the special mode of composition of Greek astrological texts is one of the reasons why literal translations of Greek astrological texts is so important. The reader should not be denied access to that experience, and that is something that Schmidt often talked about. When you do not have the same experience as I did in translating this material, then you would read over certain passages that turn out to be quite important in understanding what's going on here. So I then continued. Other modern translators such as Holden and Riley, unaware that such texts are riddling by design, cope with these difficulties by smoothing them over with so much guesswork and often guessing wrong. So I do not consider it my role as translator to make these texts seem clearer or simpler than they actually are. And that is what happened in the other translations. So beware of basing your arguments for this or that or whatever on these translations, because they might not reflect the original difficulty of the text as such. So, and that's exactly that thing that Schmidt could use to ferret out the actual meaning of all these things. But having said that about these authors, he also said that it's not my intent to ridicule these translators, because the translation of ancient texts is difficult work, and I respect anyone who has attempted it at all. But he then goes on to say, well, however, Holden's translation is simply not very faithful to the original, and Riley, whose PDF is all over the internet, said that his interest was not primarily the astrological content of Valens, and he characterized his work as preliminary and not perfected. So yeah, there is a task for us to trying to get to grips with all the things that Robert Schmidt found out by delving deep into these matters for many years, which was quite difficult work, and but what he came up with is really quite interesting and very useful for us astrologers to get to grips with what the meaning of all this actually is. So, dear listeners, please join me, or rather join us, and delve into all these issues, and they will help you get a clearer perspective on the original conception of how the topics of life should be addressed and assessed astrologically. They will prove to be challenging, provocative, and very illuminating. So keep calm and stay tuned. More bad news is coming, but when you delve into it, it will be very rewarding. So I hope to see you next time. Bye.